Hello, and welcome to your notes for Shakespeare. William Shakespeare is considered to be the greatest playwright of all time. He was writing in England during the Elizabethan age, which would have been during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. This would have been between 1558 and 1603. We know that Queen Elizabeth I loved the theater, and so there are many historians who believe that one of the reasons Shakespeare became so famous was because she may have commissioned him or found him to be a favorite, and he would have been writing to please the Queen. At this time, the theater in England was in its glory days. You have possibly heard of the Globe Theater, which would be where Shakespeare's plays were performed. Everyone from all walks of life could attend the theater. Depending on the amount of money you spent on your ticket would depend again on how great your seats were. But it was available as entertainment for the working class as well as the wealthy. All of the actors were male at this time. Women were not allowed to act. And most likely, the people went to the theater already knowing the plot and already knowing the ending of every play they attended. So it's kind of different from today's movie viewing, if you will. Shakespeare wrote 3 types of plays, and that's the first thing I'd like for you to have in your notes. You can see them behind me. He wrote comedies, he wrote tragedies, and he wrote histories. And at first glance, it's pretty obvious the difference between a comedy, a tragedy, and a history. But there are also some very subtle, interesting differences that I would like for you to take note of. Now, a comedy, not only is it funny, it would have a lighter theme or message, but comedies written by Shakespeare begin in trouble and end in peace. The characters are typically not kings and queens. They're lower rank, average, normal, everyday people. And the problem is typically comedic in its form. If you're familiar with any of these comedies, men are often mistaken for women. Rich people are trading places with people who are poor. Fairly not world problem-ish type of problems. But they're always resolved in the end. The tragedies, obviously, a little different. They begin in peace and they end in trouble. They're always about people of very noble positions in life. Kings, queens, just people of high power and high position. And their choices lead to the destruction of something in their lives. And then finally, the history. These just simply demonstrate the life of a historical figure. He has several King Henrys, King Lear, that he's just written about real people who existed, and he kind of shares the story of their life on stage. All of Shakespeare's plays follow the exact same standard for their plot. The first act, Shakespeare establishes the setting, he introduces us to his characters. The second plot, the conflict is established. The third plot is the climax, where we realize that something's got to give for this situation to be resolved. Act 4 is typically falling action if you're going to use the restroom during a Shakespeare play or skip a section. Don't tell anyone I told you, but it's going to be Act 4. And finally is Act 5. You want to make sure you're back in your seats for it because the conclusion is typically unexpected and has you, just transfixed as to what will happen that you were not expecting. Just some terms that will help us interact with our reading of Romeo and Juliet. And hopefully you can see these. I'm going to try to scoot this in. The first one, get out of the way here, is the tragic hero. And there's 4 characteristics of a character that would be considered a tragic hero. First of all, they are a person of noble birth. So in order to just fit the bill for a tragic hero, you must be a person of noble birth. The second one is a fatal flaw. So let's take, for example, Macbeth is a fabulous tragic hero. He is a king in his kingdom in Scotland. He has a fatal flaw, which some might argue would be considered his pride. He evokes pity from the reader. So even though this person has an obvious fatal flaw, you still like him. Like, you're still kind of rooting for him on some level. And unfortunately, the disaster that befalls him, the misfortune that comes his way, he doesn't totally deserve. So that's what makes a tragic hero. This isn't a uniquely Shakespeare literary figure. All right, Shakespeare uses a lot of tragic heroes, but we find tragic heroes all over classical literature. So if you, and I would expect, or I would suspect that a lot of perhaps the literature maybe that you're into on your own, be on the lookout for the tragic hero. They pop up quite a bit, actually. Something else that Shakespeare was really excellent at was setting up a foil. A literary foil is a character whose personality or their actions are in striking contrast to another character. So we learn about the other character because a character that is paired with them is so drastically different. We're going to see this in Romeo and Juliet, but you see it a lot, especially in plays, because remember, the only information that we can garner has to be fed us from the mouths of the character. There's no getting inside of their head. So we do a lot to develop character in some unique ways. And finally, a soliloquy. Hopefully this is not a term that is are new to you, but a soliloquy is a speech that a character gives when they are alone. And this is extremely important in the theater for the very reasons I was just talking about. We do not have the luxury of getting inside of someone's head like you can when you're reading a novel. And so in order for us to get inside their head, the character has to verbalize it. And so we watch the soliloquy and then we kind of know what they're feeling really. There's some very famous soliloquies in Romeo and Juliet, and we will be taking a look at those. And finally, I just want to introduce you briefly to the characters in Romeo and Juliet. So if you're someone who likes to follow along or reference the characters, this might be something that you would want to write down. All right, so the time is the 14th century, which quickly in your head you should know that is the 1300s. It takes place in Verona, Italy, which is in northern Italy. It is, and there are two families, but four groups of people. So the two families are the Montagues and the Capulets. All right, Romeo is a Montague, Juliet is a Capulet. If you can't remember that, just laugh and think, why would someone name their daughter Juliet Capulet? I don't know, but they have. So on either family, or in both families, there is both a mom and a dad. And so we just refer to those, or Shakespeare refers to them as Lord Montague and Lady Montague, Lord Capulet and Lady Capulet. All right, so the son on the Montague side is obviously Romeo, and Juliet is the daughter on the Capulet side. Okay, now we also have on the Montagues a character by the name of Benvolio, and that is Lord Montague's nephew. Okay, and then on the Capulet side, we have Tybalt, all right, which is Lord Capulet's nephew. Someone else that resides in their house and is a major player is Juliet's nurse. Okay, so these are going to be many of our key players. The other two groups, one is the church, all right, and a major player is Friar Lawrence, all right, and then there's a smaller character, Friar John. He kind of pops up out of nowhere at the end. But Friar Lawrence is a major character in the novel. And then there's a group of people that I just like to call the city folk. You might call them extras. All right, but we have Prince Aeschylus. All right. We have Count Paris. All right, and we have a boy by the name of Mercutio. And Mercutio is Romeo's friend. Prince Aeschylus is kind of like the mayor of Verona, Italy, and Count Paris is actually who the gentleman that Juliet is supposed to marry and fall in love with. So these are the characters that we're going to be introducing ourselves to over the next several weeks and getting to know. As you can see, they're fairly equal on the two sides. And I hope that you are excited about reading Romeo and Juliet. It's a great example of Shakespeare. It's a story we all know, and hopefully when we're finished with it, not only will you be like, yes, I just conquered Shakespeare, but I kind of enjoyed it along the way.